There are certain dangers associated with being too ambitious for INFJs, perhaps for all people, but there's a particular INFJ perspective that is useful to bring forth. At least I would like to bring it forth in this video. So at first it might sound paradoxical. We might like to think that INFJs could only benefit from being as ambitious as possible, that INFJs are usually selling themselves short in this day and age and this world, and that they're not believing enough in their potential, and therefore that if anything they need more confidence in their ability to achieve great things rather than less confidence in their ability to be ambitious in relation to achieving those relatively or greatly great things. So what exactly do I mean then by the fact that it can be a danger for INFJs to be too ambitious? I think that INFJs, consciously or not, are more ambitious than you think. We are more ambitious than we think. But a great deal of this is unconscious, can be conscious, can be brought to consciousness, but at the price of a lot of effort, either through therapy or self-reflection. But it has to be as impartial as possible and as unrelenting as possible. And again, that is difficult because it's going to hit against certain pretty strong ego defenses, all sorts of defense mechanisms that INFJs have set up to protect themselves from having the thoughts in question. I think the ambition of INFJs, which is in fact sometimes too big to be manageable, is related to this whole concept of ego ideal. In psychoanalysis, particularly in Freudian and post-Freudian psychoanalysis, the ego ideal is one of the agencies of the self, along with the id, the ego, and the superego, tends to be folded into the superego as a superegoic structure, but some psychoanalysts consider that the ego ideal is too distinct from the superego to be folded into it, to be nested under it. I'm not going to take a position on this, but I've addressed this question before. INFJs, a lot of INFJs, with the exception of secure INFJs, experience partly difficult or traumatic childhoods that contribute to their developing a relatively vulnerable ego, a relatively fragile ego. Perhaps the best description we could give of it is it's an incomplete ego. That's lead towards adaptive submission or compliance as a way of protecting this vulnerable ego, or solipsism. And in a sense, the path of spiritualization is a path towards building enough of what had not been completely built in the ego in order to actually trust the outside world enough to become really committed to it and engaged in it and flourish within it, because we cannot really flourish except in the external world. This is our world after all, just as much as the NI world is. The thing about the ego ideal is, by a mechanism of narcissistic compensation, and I don't mean narcissistic in terms of narcissistic personality disorder, I mean just like self-directed. In the process of narcissistic compensation, the weak or weakly developed or weakly built ego often comes to be, in difficult and complex process, compensated for by a very developed and indeed a very ambitious ego ideal. And the ego ideal is this projection we have of what our ideal self could be, right? Everyone operates, consciously or not, maybe pre-consciously, subconsciously, vaguely consciously, with a notion of what they think their ideal self is, what they would like to be, what would be validated by the superego as a good thing, right? So the ego ideal is something that people have as a representation, as an internal representation of an ideal being that they aspire to be. Thing is, for example, with secure INFJs, that are the least likely to suffer from these particular sets of issues, the ego ideal is not overdeveloped. So secure INFJs tend to be comfortable with themselves and to set goals for themselves, to have an ideal self they project that is not too demanding, fairly realistic, and so there is not too much of a distance between the ego and the ego ideal. Because by definition, no one is actually perfectly in sync. There's always some distance, right? And usually what happens is that the closer you get to the ego ideal in your life achievements, for example, the ego ideal is redefined as, according to, say, a more ambitious frame, to set again at a distance and encourage a momentum towards, again, reaching it. So it's a very, very fundamental part of the psyche that everybody has, and it's linked to action, it's linked to achievement. But again, like I said, just as there can be a tyrannical and overblown superego, there can also be an overblown ego ideal, and often that is set up by the psyche as a compensation for an ego that doesn't really like itself that much, that knows it's not that strong and tends to be easily invaded by other people or its own impulses. So full of mechanisms of defense that kind of overtake its life in many ways. And often in practice, what that means is the person will say, well, I know I'm not that great. That happens in an unconscious discourse for the most part. I know I'm not that great right now. I know I'm not doing as well as I should, but I have the potential to do all these things. And that's where the combination with the INFJ set of characteristics is particularly interesting to look at. Because INFJ characteristics, first of all, you have the prism of type, which tends to encourage people in this idea that they're unique and have great potential as INFJs because INFJs are special somehow. But also the actual concrete qualities that INFJs have that distinguish them from other people is this kind of long-range thinking, focus on a few ideas and being able to see far into the future, right? So this is part of the self-description of a lot of INFJs. You can see how that is going to get inserted into the whole architecture of the ego ideal. You're going to end up with a lot of INFJs who will come across as kind of relatively humble or personable and likable in everyday interactions. In fact, not completely consciously already suffering from their compliance, knowing that they could be more than what they currently are. They're not embracing themselves as much as they could. But compensating for that with a lot of fantasy activity regarding an ego ideal that is actually very, very ambitious. Like, right now I'm not anything special, but I have the potential in the future to be a visionary, to be a great writer, to be a great psychologist. Often it comes across in writing, like I will write something that's really special. And it can actually block INFJs in the here and now, because they'll start writing something, for example, trying to create something, and they'll, just run into obstacles that everybody, experiences, because the process of creating anything has some mundane aspects, failures you learn. And because they can observe the distance between what they're doing and their, in fact, very, very overblown ego ideal, they'll just stop doing it and just call it, I'm too perfectionistic. And so they'll end up kind of being stuck in a rut in some way and not actually progressing towards spiritualization. Because in a way, they're a little bit ashamed of their inability to make the first step because that ego ideal is so demanding. And perhaps they could benefit from having something a bit more relaxed about it. I can go into more detail about this in the future if you'd like to hear more. In the meantime, if you enjoyed the video, give me a like, guys. Don't forget, I've written 2 books on the INFJ, The Infinite Soul, which is my latest one, INFJ Life in the Modern World, How to Lead an Authentic INFJ Existence in This World Here and Now, despite its hostility felt by many INFJs. Flourishing, being happy, finding spirit and meaning. This is the book to get. The link is right below. And this prequel, The Ecstatic Soul, which is the deepest investigation into the INFJ mind, what it's like to have an INFJ mind and an INFJ consciousness that you will find online. The link is below. And of course, the 2 books go very well together. And as usual, guys, my channel depends on your kind donation, so please consider joining my Patreon down below. You get access to bonus videos every 2 weeks. You interact with me and the community, get a priority for questions, and many other good things. Again, helps me massively to keep the channel going. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you next time, guys. Bye-bye.